I'm Deborah Sivas, and I'm the chair of Will's Dissertation Committee, and I have the pleasure to serve with the rest of the committee here for Will's dissertation defense today. So, as you all probably know, his topic is climate policy interactions, examining trade-offs from climate policy overlap in California. And after he completed his oral examination, we hope to award his doctoral degree in environment and resources. After this, we'll meet as a committee to go through his defense. So before we get started, we want to recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. Okay, so I'd like to just introduce Will's oral examination committee. So I'll just go through. So we have Larry Goulder, who's, Larry, you're emeritus these days, is that right? Yes, in the professor of environmental and resource economics here at Stanford. So I'll just go in the order that we're sitting. Inesh Azevedo is an associate professor of energy sciences and engineering, and by courtesy, civil and environmental engineering. Also a senior fellow at the Precourt Institute and a senior fellow at the Woods Institute. So it covers all the bases there. Next is John Wyant. He's a co-advisor to Will. He's a professor of management science and engineering, professor of energy science and engineering, and senior fellow at the Precourt Institute for Energy. Next is Jim Sweeney, professor of management science and engineering, senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, as well as a senior fellow at the Precourt Institute and a Hoover senior fellow. So we've got a very august body here. And then last but not least, Mike Mastrandrea, senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, research director for the Climate and Energy Policy Program, and director of policy at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability Accelerator, which is our newest addition. After Will has finished his presentation, we'll have time for questions by members of the audience. If you'd like to ask questions, I'll moderate that process. But just to know, we'll do in person. If you're in person, you may raise your hands and Will can answer it directly. Members of the audience attending virtually may ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box, and I'll read those questions out so that Will can answer them. All right, with that said, I'll now pass it over to Larry.
Yes, it's a pleasure to introduce Will further, and you all will hear a lot about Will's dissertation work in the next hour, but I thought I'd mention 4 things about Will in addition. Number one, as many of you already know, he's an outstanding teacher. He's contributed importantly to the E-IPER curriculum. He also actually gave at least one outstanding guest lecture in my PhD environmental econ class talking about climate change policy in California. And so I appreciate that about him. Number 2 is, well, those of you who know Will know that he's a very congenial person. And I think he applies his congeniality in very effective ways. One is that when prospective faculty or students come to Stanford, are interested in Stanford, he's often there in various meetings to meet with the candidates, tell them honestly about Stanford, and often, almost always to very good effect. I think it's been really helping in build the institution that way. Third is that although his dissertation work concentrates on California climate change policy, his research is broader than that. It goes into other areas. He's done work for Canada, on Canada climate change policy. He's also broader in the sense that although he's connected with Stanford, he's also connected in the past and present with other institutions. And in particular, he served on the UN Environmental Program in the Economy and Trade branch. And also he has a master's in environment from Griffith University in Australia. So he actually has sort of a broad reach. And the last and maybe most important thing I want to say about Will is he's already got a job. Um, he's got a job at Simon Fraser University, and from all accounts, he's really happy there because he's Canadian, and it's a nice fit. It's a beautiful environment, so we're all happy about that. So, Will, you can take it from here. You know what the rules are, and look forward to what you have to say.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Great, thank you. Good morning. Thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. Today I'm excited to share some of my dissertation research with you, titled Climate Policy Interactions, examining trade-offs from climate policy overlap in California. Now, carbon pricing is widely seen as the most cost-effective tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we are seeing an increased adoption in carbon pricing worldwide. Currently, about 24% of global emissions are covered by some form of carbon price. But these prices are low. Less than 1% of global emissions are covered by a price sufficient to achieve the target set out in the Paris Agreement of limiting climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Rather, jurisdictions are adopting a complex mix of overlapping climate policies, all intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, these policy mixes have often evolved over decades across successive governments and often through an ad hoc process of layering new policies onto the existing policy mix. Now, there are many reasons why governments might want to use multiple policies to address this issue of greenhouse gas emissions. They might be trying to address multiple market failures, achieve multiple policy objectives, or simply manage within political constraints. But the use of overlapping climate policies can lead to unintended interactions. And while there's an enormous body of literature looking at the impacts of individual climate policy instruments, there's comparatively less looking at how interactions between climate policies can affect the performance across multiple objectives. Now, there are some examples. Here are a few examples of research in this space, some done by folks in this room. And what this research shows us is that if you fail to account for policy interactions, this can lead to perverse outcomes. And so as climate policy mixes continue to expand and diversify, it's increasingly important to evaluate interactions and how they perform across multiple policy objectives. Now, there's many policy objectives, many criteria against which we could evaluate our climate policy choices. Here I'm going to present 4 that I look at in my dissertation. First, emissions reduction. What is the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions reduced from this policy? This is often the primary goal of climate change mitigation policy. But there are other objectives that are important as well. Second, we look at cost effectiveness, usually measured in dollars per ton of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And this is the idea that if we have limited resources available to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how can we achieve the most for the lowest cost? Third is innovation. How do our policy choices drive technological change that might help reduce future costs by driving new technologies or technology cost reductions? And fourth is distributional equity. How are the costs imposed by our policy choices distributed across different segments of society, and is that distribution fair? The 3 chapters of my dissertation look at different pieces of this. In the first chapter, I look at interactions between California's cap and trade program and low carbon fuel standard in terms of how they perform in terms of emissions reduction, cost effectiveness, and innovation. In the second chapter, I dive deeper into the question of innovation and look at biofuel innovation in the US in terms of cost and carbon reductions and compare the value of that against the observed policy incentives that we see at the federal and state level. And in the third chapter, I return to the case of California's low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade program to evaluate how interactions might shift the distribution of costs across different segments of society. Now, climate policy in California is broadly important for a few reasons. First, California is huge. As a country, California would represent the 5th largest economy between Germany and India and the 18th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So from both an economic and emissions perspective, state policy choices matter. And perhaps more importantly is that California is widely seen as a climate policy leader. The policies enacted here have been adopted in many other jurisdictions. We've seen this with the state pioneering the zero-emission vehicle sales mandate back in 1990. It implemented the first broad-based carbon price in the US with the cap and trade system and developed the low carbon fuel standard as an innovative policy instrument. California also has a unique authority under the Clean Air Act to set more stringent vehicle emission regulations than the rest of the country. And so while California represents less than 12% of light-duty vehicle sales, California's regulations cover more than 40% from 16 to 18 other states that have adopted these policies. Now, despite this leadership, more work remains to be done. Although California achieved its emissions target, its 2020 emissions target 4 years early, it's not yet on track to achieve its 2030 emissions target. And in particular, transportation emissions, which represent almost 40% of state emissions, have been a particularly hard sector to decarbonize. Now, transportation emissions in California are covered by two overlapping but unlinked emissions markets, which we're going to talk a lot about today. The cap and trade program, many people have likely heard of, represents a $4.7 billion in cap and trade revenue annually, and more than almost $27 billion since the program began. But there's another emissions market that also covers transportation that's unlinked to the cap and trade and is nearly as big. I think it receives far too little attention outside of wonky policy circles, and that's the low carbon fuel standard. As you can see, it represents a $3 billion market in 2023, and in recent years, it was up over $4 billion and actually larger than the cap and trade program. And failing to account for interactions between these policies can have some important consequences, which we'll talk about. Because we're going to take a deep dive on these two policies today, I want to provide some additional background on them for folks who might be less familiar. The cap and trade program sets a limit on total emissions from regulated firms and allows firms flexibility to trade emissions allowances so the lowest cost abatement opportunities can be realized. The program started in 2013, covering electricity and heavy industry, and was expanded in 2015 to cover natural gas and transportation fuel. It currently covers nearly 80% of state emissions, and cap and trade allowance prices are about $40 per ton, which has been an increase in recent years. But the policy isn't kind of a pure cap in the way you might think about it. It's a kind of a hybrid policy instrument in that cap and trade allowance prices have a price floor and price ceiling. So a price floor is the minimum price below which allowances will not be sold, and the price ceiling is a maximum price above which unlimited allowances might be sold. And that can have important implications for how these policies interact, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Policy that might be less familiar to folks, unless you've seen me present before, is the low carbon fuel standard. This regulates the emissions intensity of the transportation fuel supply, so emissions per unit of energy or per unit of output. And similarly, allows firms flexibility for how they meet that standard in aggregate. So for example, suppliers of gasoline or diesel whose emissions intensity is above the standard can either reduce the emissions intensity of their fuel by blending in greater quantities of low carbon biofuels, or they can purchase credits from suppliers of other low carbon fuels like electricity for electric vehicles. In this way, the policy acts like an implicit tax on high emissions fuels with an implicit subsidy on low emissions fuels. But it's also been shown to be less cost effective at reducing emissions than an explicit price on carbon. And the reason is because we're subsidizing fuels that are below the emissions intensity standard, these fuels still emit some emissions. So they still impose some cost on society in the form of environmental damages. And so we're implicitly subsidizing those damages, and so we're going to see greater output than might be optimal if we accounted for all the external costs of climate policy. And as we can see, credits are currently trading for about $67 per ton. This is actually a significant drop from recent years, but the important thing to note here is that these emissions allowances are much costlier than under the cap and trade program. So compared to the cap and trade program, this represents pretty expensive marginal abatement costs. So in the first chapter, I evaluate how interactions between these policies impact cost, innovation, and total emissions. And in particular, I find that using the cap and trade program alongside using the low carbon fuel standard alongside the cap and trade program can actually drive emissions leakage and result in an increase and potentially result in an increase in net emissions. So to illustrate how this interaction occurs in practice, I'm going to quickly introduce the idea of a marginal abatement cost curve. In this, the different columns represent different activities that we can use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The height of the column represents the cost of those emissions reduction activities in terms of dollars per ton, and the width of the column represents the magnitude of emissions reductions we can achieve. So to look at the policies, what a cap and trade program does in theory is set a fixed quantity of emissions reductions that occur. Whatever the cap level is below what our current emissions are, this is the quantity of emissions reductions that have to be achieved. And by allowing firms flexibility to trade allowances, we expect the lowest cost abatement opportunities to be realized first. So the price we see in the cap and trade allowance market is set at the marginal cost of emissions reduction, the cost of reducing the next ton of emissions. Because any firm who can reduce emissions for less than that will take the abatement activity, and any firm who it's more costly for would rather purchase allowances. So under just a cap and trade program, marginal cost is equal to the emissions allowance price, but the average cost of abatement is much lower. Now, when we introduce additional policy targeting sectors that are also covered by the cap and trade program, the interaction depends on the relative stringency or the abatement cost of that policy. So if, for example, we have an additional regulation that requires some low-cost abatement activity, then we don't expect this to change how the cap and trade program performs. This emissions reduction activity would have occurred under the cap and trade regardless of whether it was in place, so it doesn't change our total emissions reduction, and it doesn't change our total cost. This has been referred to as a belt and suspenders approach to climate policy. We're adding additional policy, but we're not necessarily changing anything. However, the dynamic is different when we have a policy forcing higher cost abatement. Now, this regulation is forcing some high cost abatement in orange, but that emissions reduction still counts towards what we need to achieve under the cap. So effectively, we're displacing some low cost emissions reduction with this higher cost emissions reduction. This changes the abatement activity occurring at the margin, so it depresses the cap and trade allowance price, giving the appearance of a lower cost policy. But at the same time, this has increased our average abatement cost and correspondingly our total abatement cost. And this has been referred to as the water event effect. This is because we're basically pushing down emissions in one place only to have them rise in another. And this is the type of interaction we might expect with the low carbon fuel standard. As we saw, those allowance prices were higher than the cap and trade program. So we're forcing some high cost emissions, but because those emissions reductions count under the cap, we're not necessarily changing our total emissions. We're just increasing costs. With this interaction, there's a second issue here that can actually drive emissions leakage. And it has to do with the incomplete coverage of the cap and trade program. To give a kind of extreme example, we're going to look at the life cycle emissions of corn ethanol, which represents about 70 grams of carbon dioxide per megajoule. This is just broken out into the different life cycle stages. And if the cap and trade program covered all of these emissions, then we just expect the water event effect to occur. There'd be no leakage. But the issue is the cap and trade program is an incomplete market. And there's three important sources of emissions that are not covered by the cap and trade program. There are unregulated sectors, so agriculture emissions are not covered under the cap and trade program. This has a big role to play in the production of corn for ethanol and soybeans for biodiesel and renewable diesel. There's also unregulated facilities, so biorefineries that are outside of California or that emit less than the 25,000 metric ton threshold to be covered by the cap and trade program are also not covered. So emissions associated with those are occurring outside of the cap. Now, there are a few ethanol production facilities in California that are covered, but about 88% of biofuels are imported into California. So a lot of this emissions reduction is occurring elsewhere. And third, there's indirect emissions. Emissions associated with land use change are also not covered under the cap and trade program. And so to the extent that the LCFS increases production of, in this example, corn ethanol, it's going to increase production of emissions occurring outside of the cap. And because of that water bed effect, any emissions reduction under the cap are going to be offset by other sectors as that allowance price gets lowered. So we can look at this effect now across fuels. As I mentioned, corn ethanol is a pretty extreme example because about 85% of those emissions occur outside of the cap and trade program. But to the extent that the LCFS increases production of fuels with emissions outside of the cap and trade program, it could lead to an increase in net emissions. But both the direction and magnitude of this effect are not completely clear at the outset because, as I show theoretically in the paper, the leakage depends on the ratio of covered to uncovered emissions in the fuel substitutions that occur. So if, for example, we had a bunch of corn ethanol substituting for gasoline under that low carbon fuel standard, we'd expect a lot of emissions to increase outside of the cap, a lot of leakage to occur. But when this policy was initiated back in 2011, corn ethanol was already used near its blending limit in California. We can't add much more to the California fuel system. So if, for example, we saw cellulosic ethanol replacing corn ethanol, or we see electric vehicles displacing corn ethanol, then we might see a net reduction outside of the cap. So to evaluate how this might occur in practice, I developed a computable general equilibrium model, a CGE model of California, to simulate how producers and consumers respond to policy-induced changes in relative prices under alternative policy scenarios. This type of model is particularly well suited to the question of interest because a broad-based policy like a carbon price alters the relative price of goods and factors across multiple markets. And the price of the cap and trade allowance is endogenous to how those sectors respond to emissions reduction incentives. The model covers 5 main economic sectors: transportation, electricity, heavy industry, and other commercial goods, as well as 5 electricity generation sources and the 7 main transportation fuels I showed on the previous slide, which represent about 98% of the transportation fuel energy used in California. I also include important technological details like blend constraints, the maximum volume of biofuels we can blend into the petroleum fuel supply, as well as explicit representation of the vehicle stock, which limits what types of fuel substitutions can occur. I represent capital investment using a putty clay approach. What this means is that once investment occurs in one sector, it remains fixed in that sector until it depreciates over time. The idea is this can illustrate how incentives for a certain sector can incentivize investment in long-lived capital in that sector, like fuel refineries, and can lock us into certain technological pathways. The model's solved annually from 2010 to 2030, and producers and consumers myopically maximize for utility and profits respectively. I also incorporate endogenous representation of 7 clean technologies using learning curves, as well as exogenous innovation to represent fuel economy improvements, agricultural productivity, and energy efficiency. I simulated 9 alternative policy scenarios. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail today, but I'm just going to highlight one of the questions I'm really interested in here is the impact of adding the low carbon fuel standard to the cap and trade alone. So look, comparing the both policy scenario to a cap and trade only, using this kind of textbook cap and trade, which I've illustrated before. But there's also this role of the price collar, which I mentioned, which can alter how these dynamics occur. And so I simulate those scenarios as well. And then I look at a few policy alternatives to help address potentially negative interaction effects. And I'm just going to provide an overview of these results, but I'm happy to dive deeper in the Q&A if folks are interested. So looking at the impact of the low carbon fuel standard when added to a cap and trade program using kind of a textbook cap and trade, what we find is that the LCFS leads to an increase in total emissions. Annual emissions in 2030 are 5% higher with the LCFS and cap and trade than the cap and trade alone. And total emissions from 2010 to 2030 increased by more than 100 million metric tons. This is from the LCFS driving emissions leakage through that channel we just discussed. I also find that the LCFS leads to higher costs. Average abatement costs are 8% higher, and total policy costs are $7.5 billion greater using the LCFS. So if this policy increases both costs and emissions, why would we want to include it? Well, proponents might argue that the policy is not intended to reduce emissions at lowest cost, but rather to drive innovation in the low carbon fuel sector. So through incorporation of endogenous innovation, I look at how the LCFS might drive that. I find the LCFS does encourage innovation in transportation fuels, particularly renewable diesel. And this reduces the difference in average abatement costs by about 1/3. But across a plausible range of innovation rates, it's unable to fully offset the higher cost of using this performance standard rather than an explicit carbon price. But in practice, these interaction dynamics are going to be altered by the price collar. Because the price limits, because there's a limit on the minimum and maximum price the cap and trade allowances can go for, when the cap and trade is at the price floor or price ceiling, then the implementation of the low carbon fuel standard won't alter that incentive and will add complementary abatement. So when the floor or ceiling is binding, the LCFS adds additional abatement. But when the price is in between and the cap is binding, we see this leakage dynamic. I find that in that interaction, complementary abatement is able to offset the leakage that occurs, but it doesn't prevent it from occurring entirely. So to compare kind of headline results across scenarios, here I've translated costs and benefits into a net present value dollar figure to give us kind of a direct comparison. This includes the benefits from avoided greenhouse gas emissions in the form of climate damages using the social cost of carbon, which was recently adopted by the federal government last fall, as well as avoided air pollutant damages using some marginal damage estimates from the literature for damages associated with criteria air pollutants, and then subtracted from that the policy costs measured as equivalent variation. And using our textbook case, we see that the implementation of the low carbon fuel standard reduces net benefits by $8 billion. But when we incorporate the price collar, comparing just the both policy scenario to the cap and trade only, the LCFS adds net benefits of about $6 billion. And that's because the complementary abatement is able to fully offset the higher policy costs. But as you can see, the net benefits in both of these scenarios are lower than without the price collar. This is because when the cap and trade allowance price hits that price ceiling, unlimited allowances might be sold. So we see greater emissions, So fewer benefits from avoided emissions reduction. And we also miss our climate change mitigation goals, which is an important criteria. And then looking across the policy alternative scenarios, I try a few different options, but I find the highest net benefits occur when we incorporate an obligation for the life cycle emissions of these fuels under the cap and trade program. This effectively prevents the leakage dynamic by fully accounting for those fuels, for those emissions associated with the upstream production fuels. And compared to the scenario we're in here, this can lead to an increase in net benefits of $32 billion. So the results from this chapter highlight the importance of considering policy interactions in their evaluation. I demonstrated that the LCFS can drive emissions leakage from the cap and trade program, but that fixed price elements, like using a carbon tax or incorporating these price collar elements, can provide greater abatement complementarity between instruments. We saw that the LCFS increases average abatement costs while lowering the cap and trade allowance price. This gives the impression of lower policy costs, while in fact increasing policy costs. And we also find that innovation does reduce the higher costs of a seemingly less cost-effective policy by about a third, but it's unable to fully offset those. And this highlights the importance of considering the dynamic technological change that occurs under different policy scenarios, and also highlighted a gap that I sought to fill with my next chapter, where we didn't have great estimates of innovation rates in biofuels. The latest estimates for ethanol used data only up until 2005, and there were no estimates for biodiesel and renewable diesel. And this motivates the second chapter, where I look empirically at innovation in biofuels in the US in terms of both cost reductions and carbon reductions, and then evaluate the benefits associated with those against the observed levels of incentives. So in this chapter, I look at the three most common biofuels used in the US. Ethanol is a common additive to gasoline. It can be blended in all vehicles up to a level of about 10% and higher in some flex fuel vehicles, and represents the vast majority of biofuel production. We saw this really ramp up through the 2000s, but it can only be blended to a limit of about 10%. That's why we see this leveling off after that period. Biodiesel is derived from animal fats, greases, and plant oils like soybean oil, and is blended with diesel fuels up to a limit of about 20%. And more recently, we've seen the development of renewable diesel, which is made from similar feedstocks to biodiesel, but is a drop-in replacement to diesel, so it can be blended without limit. And these policies these fuels have been supported by significant incentives. So just since 2016, they've received more than $114 billion in support through policy incentives to promote their development. And this has led to this rapid increase. Ethanol increased from about 1.5% of the gasoline fuel pool in the US in 2000 to almost 10% today. And more recently, we've seen renewable diesel develop to the point where last year, renewable diesel represented 55% of the diesel fuel pool in California. So now actually covering the majority of those fuels. But in the context of rapid vehicle electrification and rapidly approaching net zero emissions targets, it's worth asking what the value of supporting biofuels is. And biofuels receive a lot of support. In particular, there's three overlapping policies that provide significant incentives for biofuel production for fuels in California. So there's the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is a tradable performance standard similar to the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, but it differentiates fuels by their fuel type, not their emissions intensity, so long as their emissions intensity is below a threshold level. In this way, it acts similarly in that it's a subsidy to biofuels while acting as a proportionate tax on petroleum-based fuels. At the federal level, there's also a bio-based diesel tax credit, which provides a $1 per gallon tax incentive and has been in place since 2005. And in California, Oregon, and Washington, there are these low carbon fuel standards, which we've talked about in detail, are an emissions intensity standard that provides subsidies to fuels proportionally based on their emissions intensity below the set level. And using the example of renewable diesel with January data for California, we can see that the magnitude of these incentives is pretty significant. It represents about 35% of the retail cost, of the production cost of renewable diesel. And a major justification of these seemingly less cost-effective policy instruments is their ability to induce innovation. And there's two types of innovation that are important to look at here. Cost-reducing innovation, which is primarily the focus of innovation analysis, is important to look at the extent to which reducing production costs through time can increase the competitiveness of these fuels and their widespread adoption. There's a second type of innovation here that's important, particularly for biofuels, and that's carbon intensity reducing innovation. And this reduces the social costs associated with each gallon of biofuel consumption. If we reduce the emissions intensity, there are fewer costs imposed on society in the form of environmental damages. And so in this chapter, I evaluate what we've seen in both cost-reducing innovation and carbon-reducing innovation, and look at those benefits in comparison to the level of policy incentives that we've seen. Experience curves are a widely used approach to represent innovation, to see the change in cost associated with a change in cumulative production. This typically follows a power law function, which allows us to describe the proportional cost decline associated with each doubling in cumulative production, also known as this learning curve approach, which you may be familiar with. And cumulative deployment has been shown to be closely correlated with cost declines. Across more than 100 clean tech estimates in a review by Thomas et al., they found that cumulative deployment was associated with 73% of the observed variation in prices. And a recent study by Meng and co-authors found that model-based forecasting approaches were better able to predict clean technology cost declines than expert elicitation. But of course, cumulative production is not the only driver in prices that we see in biofuels. So I look at multi-factor learning curve options to incorporate some other important elements. Here, the outcome is looking at price with data from the USDA, and I look at potential drivers of cost declines, including cumulative production, but also feedstock costs, production scale, and policy costs are found to play an important role. And I also consider time trends, R&D expenditure, cumulative knowledge stock, and mandates under the RFS. Some of this data is only available at the annual level, which provides much less heterogeneity than we observe in fuel prices. So the preferred model includes these variables of cumulative production, feedstock price, scale, and policy costs. And what we see in terms of cost-reducing innovation is relatively high learning rates for ethanol. So we see a 21.8% cost decline for each doubling in cumulative production. Here, the preferred model is indicated in blue with the 95% confidence interval with the error bars, and the highest and lowest estimates presented with the X's. As you can see, ethanol here corresponds with the previous estimates in the literature that use data up until 2005. So it's within the range that we might expect. But these new estimates for biodiesel and renewable diesel find a much lower magnitude of innovation occurring. Now, this could be because these fuels are benefiting from knowledge spillovers, learning that already occurred with ethanol production, but it highlights an important question about what types of cost reductions we might expect in the future. The issue of carbon intensity reducing innovation is also particularly important here. So to illustrate this point, we can look at ethanol use in California. The red line here indicates the blend rates, the percentage of ethanol blended into the gasoline fuel pool in California. And as you can see, it's remained relatively unchanged. During this time, ethanol has received about $14 billion in incentives, but the percentage of the fuel supply and also the total volume hasn't really changed at all. It suggests this isn't displacing additional gasoline that we might expect from this policy incentive. But what we do see is that the carbon intensity of ethanol has dropped by about 30%. This suggests there might be other benefits associated with these policies in terms of reducing their carbon intensity through time. So I follow a similar approach to estimating carbon intensity reductions, looking at a single factor learning curve model, as well as other potential drivers, including time trends, policy costs, and importantly, the type of feedstock. Here I use only data from California, because we wouldn't expect this type of innovation to occur necessarily in jurisdictions that don't have policy incentives like the LCFS, because they economically reward fuel producers for reducing their carbon intensity. Outside of California, you don't necessarily receive an economic benefit from reducing your carbon intensity. And here I use certified production pathways registered with the California Air Resources Board. So if you want to sell fuels into California, you have to register with the California Air Resources Board with your life cycle carbon intensity and the feedstock you use, which allows us to assess how these have changed through time. I'm going to look at just the example of renewable diesel to illustrate the results here, but these qualitatively hold across other fuels. We see that carbon intensity does see a small declining trend with experience. So doubling in cumulative production is associated with a reduction in emissions intensity of about 1 to 3%. And we see that we also see an increasing trend of carbon intensity with low carbon fuel standard prices. This suggests that the higher the low carbon fuel standard allowance price, it's going to pull higher carbon intensity biofuels into the market. So these effects are kind of working against each other. But most importantly, the feedstock choice accounts for about 97% of the observed variation in carbon intensity. And we can see this illustrated in this figure here, where the difference between emissions intensities of different feedstocks is much larger than the trend within any individual feedstock. And this has really important implications for the potential and future emissions intensity reduction of these fuels. For example, switching from soybean oil to used cooking oil could reduce your carbon intensity by more than 50%. But unfortunately, since about 2021, almost all of the used cooking oil available to produce biofuels was already being used for that purpose. So we have no more used cooking oil to produce biofuels. And since 2021, we've seen the production of renewable diesel triple. So increasingly, to meet these expanding demands for biodiesel production, we have to rely on higher carbon feedstocks, often produced from agricultural products that compete with food and other sources, in order to meet these policy incentives. And this calls into question what the long-term decarbonization potential is for these technologies if we're being forced to use higher carbon feedstocks in order to meet the regulatory standards. And finally, we can look at the social benefits associated with biofuel production and see how they compare with the observed incentives. And in particular here, I'm interested in looking at two types of important benefits. Environmental benefits in terms of avoided climate damages, and innovation benefits in terms of reduced future production costs. Now, environmental benefits here should be considered an upper bound. I make some generous assumptions that each unit of biofuel production perfectly displaces a petroleum fuel on an energy equivalent basis. We wouldn't expect that to occur in practice because if we reduce the costs of biofuel consumption, there might be greater consumption that offsets some of these environmental benefits, but we consider this an upper bound simply for comparison. In addition to these environmental benefits across fuels, we can look at the innovation benefits. We see that these can be fairly substantial for ethanol, about 25% of the total social benefit because of that high innovation rate. But for biodiesel and renewable diesel, these are relatively small components of the social benefits. And most interestingly, we can compare this with the level of observed incentives across these three stacked policies that we discussed earlier. And as you can see, the level of incentives vastly outstrips the level of benefits that we're seeing from these policies. And this raises questions about what role these stacked incentives should play in driving additional biofuel consumption. So in this chapter, we looked at innovation rates in terms of cost and carbon reductions. We saw that learning rates in ethanol have been substantial. This largely corresponds with the previous literature. And new estimates for biodiesel and renewable diesel show particularly low learning rates. We also found that improvements in emissions intensity are largely driven by feedstock choice, and that this poses a potential threat to future emissions intensity reduction. And there's also questions about what extent this actually illustrates innovation. Because California is one of the only markets that rewards economically fuels in terms of their emissions intensity reduction, it's possible that fuels produced outside of the state are being shuffled into California by the lowest carbon fuels because you get the biggest economic premium, and that without the policy, those might have been consumed elsewhere. And together we see that these stacked incentives for biofuels exceed the social benefits in terms of emissions reduction and cost reduction. So far we've looked at emissions reduction, innovation, and cost effectiveness. And in the third chapter, I want to turn to that fourth policy objective of distributional impacts. And here I want to return to the interactions between California's cap and trade program and low carbon fuel standard to see how those interactions might play out in terms of distributional impacts. So the average household in California spends about $5,500 on energy services in terms of electricity, natural gas, and transportation fuel. But these costs aren't evenly distributed across households. Households in the lowest income decile spend more than 20% of their income on these energy services, where households in the highest income decile spend less than 3%. And so when we enact climate policies that alter the cost of energy, it has the potential to exacerbate inequality when we change the relative costs of these energy services. And while there's been significant work on the distributional impacts of carbon pricing, there's been comparatively less work looking at the impacts of performance standards, and particularly interactions between the two. And there's been no research previously on the household impacts of the low carbon fuel standard specifically. So in this chapter, I estimate direct household policy costs I do this by taking data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey that looks at how more than 2,200 households spent their money on a quarterly basis. And here I look at particularly expenditure on electricity, natural gas, home heating oil, and other fuels, as well as transportation fuel. This also provides important household demographic data that we can dig into a little bit later. I then use quarterly energy price data from the Energy Information Administration to try to back out the consumption level of these different fuels, and then use data from the California Air Resources Board and the EPA to estimate household policy costs based on the fuel consumption and allowance prices, as well as the revenue rebates associated with these policies. So unlike other forms of regulation, carbon pricing generates significant revenue, which can be used to mitigate potential distributional impacts or policy regressivity. And there's two main destinations for proceeds from cap-and-trade allowance auctions. There's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is the destination of about 60% of auction revenues in California. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is used to support a variety of government programs. Some of these support additional emissions reduction, but others target other goals like clean water, affordable housing, or wildfire mitigation and recovery. About 40% of the proceeds are given to utilities or allocated to utilities, and then they're required to use the proceeds from those auctions for ratepayer protection. So the majority of that is used to provide credits on your electricity or natural gas bill, if you're with a big investor-owned utility, to mitigate some of the higher policy costs from the cap-and-trade program. We can see that with the example of PG&E here. So we see these rebates to households. You'll usually see them in April, occasionally also in October with your electricity provider. This can have important implications for the distributional impacts by mitigating some of the initial cost incidents. So for this direct household cost incidence estimate, I look at cap-and-trade policy costs both before and after these utility rebates, but I initially don't include spending through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And that's because it's really hard to identify at a household level who's benefiting from these programs. I do also look at the distribution of policy costs across counties. And in that analysis, which I'm not going to present today, but I'm happy to talk about after, we can see the spatial distribution of where this program spending occurs and what the costs are like in those regions. So looking at the policy costs across these different policies, we see that the cap-and-trade program has very regressive policy costs at the outset. What I mean by this is that lower income households spend a greater share of income on this policy than households with high income. The cap-and-trade policy, the initial cost is indicated in the solid blue line, but after accounting for utility rebates, we see with the dashed line that we can really mitigate some of these regressive incidents. So households in the lowest income decile reduce their policy costs by about 50% after accounting for these utility rebates. But the policy is still somewhat regressive. And it's similar in magnitude to what we see for the low carbon fuel standard, where households in the lowest income decile spend more than 4 times what households in the highest income decile face. But these are median values, and there's substantial heterogeneity within any particular income decile that is worth considering here. So a lot of distributional analysis of policy impacts looks at vertical equity. We look at households of different income levels and assess what the impacts are. There's also the issue of horizontal equity, and this is based on the idea that households of similar means should face similar policy costs. And we can look at that with this household level data. We can look at those cost impacts for the cap-and-trade program and low carbon fuel standard. And those are visualized with these density plots here. And as you can see, the cap-and-trade program leads to much wider horizontal impact. What I mean by that is some households are made much better off by the policy before even accounting for environmental benefits. They receive net, the rebates are greater than their policy costs, so they come out net ahead. Whereas there are also people who face significant costs. About 10% of households in the lowest income decile spend more than 1% of their total income on cap-and-trade policy costs, even after accounting for rebates. We also see that the low carbon fuel standard has much more concentrated horizontal impacts. This might reflect a trade-off in the policy of the cap-and-trade program because its increased cost effectiveness is associated with this broad price that applies to all sorts of energy goods and services, whereas the low carbon fuel standard is more concentrated. This can lead to horizontal equity impacts. But there are some reasons that households consume lots of energy, which we might want to penalize with climate policy to try to induce behavior change, but there are other things we might not want to change. So to look at And some well-off households also receive significant rebates from electric vehicles. Because LCFS revenue is used for electric vehicles, we can see that those well-off households can be net beneficiaries as well. But diving into some of the attributes associated with high policy costs, we're going to look at what might be driving these horizontal equity impacts. Here I used a lasso regression, which stands for least absolute shrinkage selection operator. And what this does is essentially look at a whole bunch of potential drivers of policy costs and identify which are the strongest, which give us the most predictive power. So it's essentially an OLS regression, but imposes a penalty parameter on weak predictors, so we can identify which attributes are most strongly associated with higher policy costs. In particular, I find that there are two attributes that have a stronger relationship with policy cost than income, and those are family size and number of vehicles. And while we might want to discourage households from owning a whole bunch of vehicles for climate policy reasons, we probably don't want to discourage households from living in larger family units, particularly because we'd see lower energy use per person in a larger household than if everyone lived on their own. This also suggests there might be better ways to target cap and trade revenue use to address some of these impacts. For example, returning rebates on a per capita basis rather than on a per household basis might be able to address some of these equity dimensions. We also see some fairly unsurprising findings that LCFS and total policy costs are negatively correlated with EV ownership. If you're driving an EV, not only do you not have to pay the carbon tax with gasoline, but you can also receive, and LCFS costs of gasoline, you can also receive rebates under the LCFS program. And cap and trade costs are negatively correlated with electric home heating and positively correlated with number of bedrooms. If you have a larger house, it's going to have greater policy costs to keep warm. So based on these findings, I looked at some alternative approaches to using revenue to address equity impacts. I tested 4 alternative approaches, only 2 of which I'm presenting here because these have the biggest impact. But per household rebates, looking at if we gave every household, including renters and those who don't pay utility bills, rebates under the cap and trade program, per capita rebates, so giving every person rather than every household, means testing these rebates, so limiting rebates and EV subsidies to individuals earning less than $100,000 or households earning less than $125,000, as well as trying a rural supplement, so allocating 30% of this revenue use to rural households to mitigate some of their higher costs. And here what I've done is essentially just take the same quantity of revenue we're currently using through utility rebates and look at different ways of allocating it. And what we find here is that the impacts are relatively modest compared to any type of revenue recycling, but there are ways to slightly improve the progressivity or reduce the regressivity of these policy impacts. And in particular, means testing is able to significantly reduce the cost by about half for households in the lowest income decile, with relatively small cost implications for households in the highest income decile. And the second most progressive shift would be per capita rebates. This highlights some potential opportunities to even improve upon the distributional impacts of these policy choices. And finally, I looked at interactions between these policies and how they might shift the distribution of costs across different segments of society. So in the first chapter, using the model from the first chapter, I ran a bunch of simulations to see alternative policy combinations to achieve the same quantity of emissions reduction. And here we can consider scenarios that from using a cap and trade alone to an increasing reliance on the LCFS in order to achieve emissions reduction, and to see if that changes who's facing higher costs associated with these policies. I'm just going to show 2 of these scenarios for simplicity here. But as we can see, using the cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard together increases policy costs across income deciles. Now we might expect this because of the higher policy costs associated with using both policies. That cost is distributed across everyone, and so we see increased costs across deciles. And this suggests that there's no equity efficiency trade-off in the policy choice. Relying more on a cap and trade program is both more efficient and more equitable, and can contribute to kind of better outcomes across these elements. So in this chapter, we saw that the low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade program are both found to be regressive. But the cap and trade program has this benefit of generating substantial revenue, which can be strategically deployed to reduce some of those regressive impacts. We saw that means testing or per capita rebates could help improve the regressivity of those outcomes. But we saw that the cap and trade program leads to broader horizontal impacts across groups within an income decile. And finally, we saw that adding the low carbon fuel standard to the cap and trade increases household impacts across income deciles. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at policy interactions in California in terms of their emissions reduction, cost effectiveness, innovation, and distributional equity. In the first chapter, we saw that the LCFS could drive emissions leakage from the cap and trade program, but that using elements of a fixed price instrument can improve complementarity, and that the LCFS increases average abatement costs while lowering cap and trade allowance prices. In the second chapter, we saw that innovation rates in bio-based diesel are much lower than ethanol, and that feedstocks might represent a constraint on continued emissions intensity reductions. In the last chapter, we saw that both the cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard appear regressive, and the cap and trade program has wider horizontal impacts, but there are options for mitigating some of that regressivity through means testing rebates. Now, zooming out, I think the big thing this highlights is that we can't consider climate policy choices in a vacuum. Interactions can alter the way these policies perform, and so considering these interactions can have important implications across the objectives we care about. I think this also raises questions about what role the low carbon fuel standard should play in achieving emissions reduction in California's climate policy portfolio. And there, I think it's important to recognize that there might be other criteria that I haven't directly addressed here, and particular political acceptability. It's kind of been anecdotally talked about that the intention of the low carbon fuel standard might be to depress cap and trade allowance prices, to have less salient costs so people don't know about it and aren't worried about it. And maybe that's true. This research doesn't directly address kind of what role political acceptability plays, but if that is true, this at least gives us some preliminary cost estimates for what the costs of political acceptability are in terms of cost effectiveness, distributional equity, and emissions reduction. And in particular, I think it's important to note that I don't think political acceptability is some immutable trait we can kind of describe, but rather should be a function of how policies perform across the objectives we care about. So the better we can understand how policy interactions perform across these important objectives should be able to change the political acceptability of those policies. And that's at least an optimistic perspective on it. And with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Was the point to basically look at those things in like an ideal world and see what their impact would have been? Or like, did you test how well it fit the realistic, like the reality of what things actually turned out to be?
So the reason I tested that textbook model, which I highlighted to avoid some of the complications today, is to kind of see theoretically what might we expect to occur. And then I incorporated the price collar to look at what might occur in practice. And so it results in this trade-off that emissions leakage continues to occur when the cap constraint is binding, but when the floor and ceiling constraint are binding, then we expect additional abatement. And so the result kind of really depends on how long we're in between the floor and ceiling floor, as we currently are in the cap and trade program. And I think that effect, I mean, there are various predictions about to what extent that might occur, but we know that leakage is occurring during that dynamic. I also looked at how this model compared to reality, and particularly because we've seen some significant variation in prices. And I found that it's a little bit early in what we see under the low carbon fuel standard, but it provides a relatively reasonable comparison for what we've observed in practice, and particularly this high peak and then decline in low carbon fuel standard prices. It does tend to overestimate cap and trade policy costs a little bit. That's because it doesn't represent strategic banking behavior or some of these other policies that might help depress that cost.
I had I guess, two questions on your third chapter.
Mm-hmm.
When you were talking about the distributional impacts of California's climate policy. So I think my understanding of a lot of like the way that the state is trying to address distributional impacts is happening at like really fine, one of some of these initiatives happening at a fine spatial level, like at the census tract level.
Yeah, certainly.
If you think of like 25% of the auction revenue is going to what's deemed disadvantaged communities through the CalEnviro definition. And I realize that your survey that you're using, this expenditure survey, might not allow you to look at the impacts, but I think it'd be really fascinating to look at like your direct cost of direct energy use at that same spatial resolution as where the state is funneling a lot of auction revenue and see how that compares. And thinking again about the spatial impacts of climate policies, are you able to look, because in your first chapter, we're talking about you also have some estimate of the air pollution benefits of different climate policies, because now you're just looking at the direct energy costs and some allocated revenue through the utilities,
Yeah.
but can you also look at the different kind of benefits in terms of air pollution reductions, also at a spatial level between the cap and trade and the
Yeah.
low carbon fuel?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the next step that I want to get to with this. So I've looked at these at the county level, which, like, as you say, is like very highly aggregated compared to where some of these benefits and costs are accruing. But that same approach, I use iterative proportionate fitting to kind of match our household data to county level estimates. But you could do that at the census tract level as well. One of the issues is that I don't have geographic data on households, but there are some opportunities for that and like combining RAS data. But I think that's kind of the next step here, looking at both the policy costs at very fine resolutions, incorporating that spending, so where that money is being used to benefit individual households, and then the air pollution impact as well. Anesh has done some of this work, and his students have done this work, and I think that's kind of where I'd like to go with the next step of looking at, well, maybe the low carbon fuel standard might shift where emissions are occurring and result in important distributional benefits that way. So I think I totally agree.
Could you please elaborate more on the horizontal equity? I feel like I wasn't clear on what exactly that means in terms of the different policies.
Sure, yeah. So the idea with horizontal equity is that different households of similar means, similar income levels might face very different costs. And so that can have to do with a bunch of attributes at the household level. It could be demographic attributes, to do with the individual dwelling attributes, the type of homes that people are in, or the types of transportation they use. These are just some of the variables I was able to glean from the consumer expenditure survey data and to see what role they might play in driving higher costs. So like a surprising result I found here was that rural households wasn't one of the strongest predictors of higher policy costs. But I think that's a function of other predictors that are associated with living rurally. You might own more vehicles, you might have a larger home, and you might use other sources of heating that aren't electric. And so looking at the different ways that these costs are distributed might help us better target the way we're using revenue to help mitigate some of these costs. There's been some recent work by Severin Borenstein looking at kind of who's using lots of energy in California, and it's not always who you might predict. And there are some kind of groups that might need to use more energy for lots of reasonable reasons that we don't want to penalize through policy levers. And so that's starting to try to get at that question.
I don't mean for this to be a difficult one. I'm just really excited to be in a room with you because you know so much about biofuels. What do you think is like the future of biofuels in cars in the U.S.?
So I can't predict the future. But I think we have seen that like there are opportunities for vehicle electrification that are taking on rapidly. And I think what some of this research highlights is like, is this a good way to use policy to drive technological change, particularly when there might be higher value uses of biofuels like aviation fuel or marine shipping? And so an open question I have that stems from this is, by inducing this additional biofuel use through road transportation policies, are we pulling feedstocks and resources away from aviation fuels or marine fuels to be used in road transportation? Or are we driving innovation in the use of those fuels that might result in lower costs for aviation later? And I think there's a trade-off there that merits further research. I know Anela has been doing some work on this, but I think it's something we need to think about because net zero targets are approaching, and biofuels for road transportation are not going to get us there. Wrap up there. I would just like to say thank you for everyone for being here and for being a part of this. This is a long journey, but I really appreciate being here. I'd also like to really thank my two lead advisors, Larry and John, for all the time and effort and thought you've put into this. Many hours from sitting in your office in first year complaining about the microeconomics sequence through to now teaching microeconomics to public policy students this fall. So things have come a long way, and I really appreciate all the time you've invested in this, and I've learned a ton. I'd just like to thank the other members of my committee, Anesh, Mike, and Jim, for your enthusiasm to engage with this work, your always willingness to talk about this, as well as to pull me into your research groups. I've had a really fruitful engagement with all of your research groups and made great friends and collaborators along the way, and so I'm really appreciative of that. And Debbie, thank you for playing the role of chair. You've done a wonderful job. Of course, I'd like to thank funders. This would not have been possible without the generous funding of the Kimmelman E-IPER Fellowship, the Gerald J. Lieberman Fellowship, as well as funding from Canada's Social Science and Humanities Research Council, and research grant funding through E-IPER. I'd also like to thank the E-IPER staff. They do a wonderful job. They work so hard and also make E-IPER such a warm and welcoming environment. And I feel very lucky to have been in this program and benefit from all of that. And I'd also like to thank the community, the E-IPER community and friend communities beyond that. I have the luck of having a wonderful cohort that has really fostered a sense of community, despite kind of having vastly different research interests and approaches, as well as all the friends who've made this so much fun along the way. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank my family for making the trip out here, including the newest members, my niece and nephew, who provide constant entertainment. And of course, our 2 dogs, Fitz and Miko, who are really an important role. If, like, the best advice I can give you for doing a PhD is get a dog. Because without fail, every day, they would promptly remind me when it's time to stop working and go for a walk. And that was really valuable. And thank you all for coming. This has been so wonderful.